Okay, so I decided to post this video publicly because I realize a lot of interpreters have actually been looking at my PHI review, like what is and what isn't PHI for medical interpreters. So I'm going to go ahead and share this activity, not just for my students so they can see what they got wrong, what they got right, why it was wrong, why it was right, but because I think it's very important for medical interpreters as a whole to just understand HIPAA a little bit better and to understand PHI a little bit better. So in case you don't remember, PHI stands for Protected Health Information. And so PHI is, remember, it's going to be any of these identifiers. So any of those 18 PHI identifiers combined with health information. So health information is someone's past, present, or future medical condition, the provision of health care to an individual, or past, present, future payment of health care. So those two things combined, those two categories, health information and the 18 PHI identifiers, that equals PHI. I know it might seem kind of silly to post the answers to a homework assignment publicly on YouTube. However, I'm going to make sure I'm going to be tricky myself for any students in the future who want to be tricky. And I'm actually going to do this in a way to where someone can't just look at the video and get a screenshot of the video and boom, there are all the answers in one place. You're going to have to watch this whole video to see all the answers. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I have here is a social security card you find in the grocery store parking lot. Is it PHI? Is it not PHI? That's this first guy up here in the corner. So a social security card in and of itself, unless it's tied to health information, it's not going to be PHI. So if you find a social security card in a clinic waiting room, for instance, on the floor in a medical facility's hallway, for instance, that would be considered PHI because you're like, okay, how did that social security card get there? Probably because that person was there in that facility. But if you find it in the grocery store parking lot, not PHI. Because if someone's social security number and their name are PHI identifiers, unless they are attached to health information, it's not PHI. So as far as I'm concerned, this first one belongs solidly in the category of not PHI. So as not to, again, make it easy for everyone to see what all the answers are, I'm going to put this guy back where it belongs, and then we're going to go ahead and move on to the next one. So the next one we have is a shredded health insurance card. A shredded health insurance card. So your health insurance card obviously has your name, your member ID number on it, things like that. But because it's shredded, it is considered de-identified. So it's essentially like, unless it's only like cut in half and the person just has to put the two halves of the card together, that's one thing. But in this case, I mean, it's shredded, it's been de-identified. So this would not be considered to be PHI. Not PHI, a shredded health insurance card. So moving on to the next one. We have interpreter's notes from a medical appointment that are mostly symbols, acronyms, and phone numbers. So listen, some of these they might not outright be PHI. We could even cast like a shadow of a doubt on this. Like, okay, we're using symbols, we're using acronyms, we're not using people's names. You know, it might explain someone's health condition, but there's no personally identifiable information on there. There's none of those 18 PHI identifiers, right? So the thing is, though, is that we have here phone numbers. And chances are, if you're writing down phone numbers, you're likely going to be writing down a phone number that can be tied back to the patient. So the argument could be made for this one to not be PHI, but I do like to go ahead and just throw this one under PHI because the likelihood of it being PHI, this is a thing about a lot of this stuff, is it's a matter of probability. Okay. Is it better to protect this information than not? Is it better to assume that it's PHI than not? Yeah, it is. I'd rather err on the side of caution. Even in responding to some of the students' homework, I said, listen, like you have a lot of stuff under this PHI column and you don't have a whole lot of stuff under the not PHI column. I'd much rather you mistake something for PHI and take the effort to protect it than take something that is PHI and say, oh, well, that's not PHI, and then you handle it carelessly. You're expending a lot of extra effort and energy on that. But again, you're erring on the side of caution, so I think that's okay. But those first two that we have, a social security card you find in the grocery store parking lot and a shredded health insurance card, I would put that on not PHI. Social security card, obviously we need to keep it safe, right? It is classified under this type of information that's called PII, personal identifiable information, something that can identify an individual, but it's not attached to health information, therefore it's not PHI. The next thing that we have, this I think is honestly the trickiest one, a Google Calendar event with a patient's address. You're their interpreter for their home visit with a social worker. So the reason why I put this one on here is because I see interpreters being really, really good about, some interpreters being really, really good about protecting PHI, except when it comes to this. This is one that I do like to classify as PHI, simply because, okay, you can make the argument that they're having a home visit with a social worker. It might not be a health-related thing, so it might not even be covered under HIPAA. However, we do have a patient's address, right? So it's a patient. So this implies that it is some kind of healthcare relationship. 2, you have a date and a time in the calendar along with an address. Okay, I discussed this in my Digital Security Basics course that I'm going to be publishing shortly. It's going to be a CEU course that Google, and I say this using Google Draw here, I use Google services, but I also understand and recognize that my privacy on Google platforms is not guaranteed. So you have to keep in mind that a Google Calendar is not secure. You should be really, really careful about putting this information in a Google Calendar. It's one thing to put an address of a healthcare facility. It's a whole other thing to put a patient's address in there. And then, any number of things can be tied back to that appointment. They see your email address. Okay. KGH interpretation. All right. So they see there, all right, so this person is clearly using an interpreter for this. This is an appointment that an interpreter is being used at. It's a medical appointment. They might be able to string together all this information that would lead to the identity of the patient and the fact that they were provided healthcare on a date and time. So, like I said, it's a probabilities game. This one, more likely than not, is going to be PHI. There's certainly an argument that could be made for it not being PHI. For instance, it's just the address and yes, date and time, but, okay, well, it's a visit with a social worker and it's not a medical visit. It's not a mental health visit. But, you really got to go the extra length to prove that this one's not PHI. So I'd much rather put it under PHI. Next up, an agenda containing patients' names and dates of birth, but you keep it with you at all times. Again, this is another example that I have seen. I have seen interpreters record their appointments in agendas, especially in-person interpreters or any interpreters who work on appointments. I respect the fact that we're not entering this information digitally because honestly, it's very difficult to keep digital information to yourself, but it's still really risky to do this because then you have all of this information, a tremendous amount of information in one place. And, listen, if we have patients' names, dates of birth, the dates of their appointments, things like that, we're acknowledging the fact that this is an interpreter's agenda, right? Because we're assuming that if you're doing this assignment, you're an interpreter, you're a medical interpreter, because this is from a medical interpreter training classes, that is protected health information. Because if someone gets a hold of that agenda and they know that you're a medical interpreter, they know, okay, all of these dates and times for appointments, these are all dates and times for appointments for medical appointments. And now I have all of the patients' names and dates of birth. So this one is one of those ones where it's really difficult to make the argument that it's not PHI. So I always just put it under PHI. So just because you keep it at all times with you and you keep it safe, that doesn't mean that it just suddenly stops being PHI. That information is still PHI. It can still be misused in the wrong hands. Then we have an interpreting assignment sheet, but all information that could possibly identify the patient is blacked out. So this one, I just want to briefly explain. So an interpreting assignment sheet, especially if you're an in-person interpreter, you're typically going to have the name of the interpreting agency. You're going to have the date and time of the appointment, the address of the appointment, the patient's name, the patient's date of birth, sometimes a medical specialty, sometimes a patient phone number in some cases. That, of course, is PHI. However, when we go ahead and block out all that information that could possibly lead it back to that individual patient, we just have the interpreting agency name, a date, maybe we have the address there of the facility. Once you block out all of that information that could possibly be tied back to the patient, it stops being PHI. It's been de-identified. That's one of the other ways that you can de-identify information. You can shred that information just like that health insurance card, or you can black out all of that information. To me, this is not PHI, as I said, not PHI. Then we have here, a patient was seen by Dr. Smith at Main Street Clinic in 2021. So we need to remember our little diagram that we had when we were going over what is PHI and what isn't PHI, the 18 PHI identifiers. Do we have any PHI identifiers here? Now we might have the name of the doctor, we might have the name of the clinic, and the year. But do we have any information here that would tie it back to a particular patient? No. So even though a lot of people answer that this was PHI, it's actually not PHI because we're not tying it back to an individual patient. We're making it very general. Now, if we had something there like a patient who speaks insert rare language here, or a patient who has insert rare health condition here was seen by Dr. Smith at Main Street Clinic in 2021, the argument could be made that that's PHI. That's something we need to keep secret and safe. But, this as it's written can't really be tied back to an individual. It doesn't have any of those 18 PHI identifiers that tie it back to a particular patient. Last up, we have a voice recording or transcript of an interpreted appointment. Multiple things to take into account here. A voice recording of an interpreted appointment. Chances are, when you have interpretation going on, you're also going to have the voice of the patient in there, speaking their native language, if they're a limited English proficient patient. So we have to remember that one of those 18 PHI identifiers are biometric identifiers, and voice prints are one of those biometric identifiers. So someone's voice can identify them, almost like a fingerprint. So there's that. The information that's contained within that medical appointment. That person's likely going to be talking about their medical history. So now we have a biometric identifier tied back to health information. So that is definitely PHI, without a doubt. Now, if we have a transcript of an interpreted appointment, it's just all of the text of all of the information that was exchanged during that appointment. You'd be hard-pressed to have a transcript of an appointment that wouldn't have any of those 18 PHI identifiers in it. More likely than not, it's going to be PHI. And the fact that we have on here a voice recording, and you could make the argument like, oh, it's just the interpreter interpreting being recorded. Even then, it's just like those interpreter's notes from a medical appointment. Even if you think they're mostly symbols, mostly acronyms, it's better to err on the side of caution and say, listen, there could be some PHI identifiers in here. It's, again, that probabilities game, more likely than not. And the reason why I mention this one particularly is because I have heard in some circles of folks turning on Chrome's auto captioning while they're providing remote interpretation services to kind of assist them in things they might not hear, or if they get behind on their interpretations, what have you. That to me is a very worrisome recommendation for multiple reasons. One, all of the information going on in that appointment, we're likely discussing patient information. You might even have the provider saying, could you please state for me your name and your date of birth? That's not uncommon for someone to say during an appointment. That starts it off being, we got those PHI identifiers. Then we have all this health information that gets brought up during a medical appointment. And that's being tied back to that individual, that name and that date of birth. Now, when you turn on those auto captioning features, especially in Chrome, unfortunately, I have looked up the data handling aspect of the auto captioning. It doesn't specify whether any usage data is sent back to Google. So you always want to make sure that when you're processing, entering information digitally that could potentially be PHI and likely is PHI, that you're very, very careful with the services that you use to handle that information. So you always want to err on the side of caution there. And I will say that Google as a company does have a little bit of a kind of shady history when it comes to data security and data privacy. Gmail has even stated that users of its free service have no reasonable belief that their information is going to be kept secure and private. So given that kind of company culture historically, and the fact that they're not abundantly transparent about how that data is being used is kind of shady to me. And I'm by no means saying that Google is out here to steal your information and, violate HIPAA and stuff like that. I'm just saying that it's better to be safe than sorry. So I just say with this particular one to err on the side of caution and assume that it's PHI. Like I said, probabilities game, right? That one is more than likely going to be PHI. So we need to handle all of this information that is PHI safely and securely, but even the information that isn't necessarily PHI, like that social security card, doesn't mean that we shouldn't safeguard that information. It just means that it is not PHI. And therefore, if we don't keep that information private, well, we might not be in trouble under HIPAA. So I hope that clears up anyone's questions, doubts, comments, concerns about this exercise. But for those of you who didn't complete this exercise, I hope this was enlightening, and I hope it helped to clarify some of the differences between what is and what isn't PHI.